The door slammed shut behind him, its loud echo reverberating through the empty apartment. I froze, my breath catching as I turned to look at him. His expression was tight, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't quite understand. Before I could ask what was wrong, he moved closer, closing the distance between us in a single step. His hand, warm and firm, brushed against my cheek as he pulled me in. Without warning, his lips pressed against mine. It wasn't a tender kiss. It was urgent, filled with a passion I hadn't felt from him in years. My thoughts were racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't the man I had known all this time. This kiss felt like a confession, like a desperate plea for something. But what exactly? I pulled away, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. What was that? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran his hand through his hair, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice barely reached a whisper. "We need to talk." Those words sent a chill through me. I'd heard them before, but never with such weight. This wasn't a conversation that would end with an apology or a simple mix-up. No, this was something different. Something far more complex. The silence between us felt thick, pressing in. I could feel the tension mounting like the air right before a storm. I wanted to ask what was going on, but the words stuck in my throat. Something told me I wasn't ready for whatever he was about to say. After a long pause, he looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something unexpected. Guilt, yes, but also a strange kind of longing. I knew then that whatever he was about to tell me, it would change everything. And it all began with that kiss. The days that followed were drenched in an unbearable silence. We went through the motions, work, dinner, the usual. But something had shifted. I could sense it in the way he avoided eye contact, in how his touch lingered just a little longer than before. It was as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. It was a Tuesday evening, and we sat at the dinner table. The clinking of our forks against our plates was the only sound breaking the silence. He cleared his throat, causing me to look up. His face was tight, that same expression from the night he kissed me. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, carefully, choosing his words. "What if we tried something different?" I frowned, unsure of where this was going. "Different?" I repeated, my voice a mixture of curiosity and unease. He nodded, setting down his fork. His gaze was steady as it met mine, and for the first time in days, he didn't look away. "I've been thinking about us. About what we might be missing. What if we tried something new together?" The vagueness of his words only deepened my discomfort. I could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I didn't know what to say, so I just stared at him, waiting for him to explain. My stomach churned with a mix of dread and curiosity. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "What if we explored something with other people?" The room seemed to shrink, the air suddenly thick with tension. I blinked, struggling to process his words. It felt like the ground beneath us was cracking open, ready to swallow everything in its path. His words lingered in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I had no idea how to respond. My mind raced, my heart thudded in my chest, but nothing coherent came out. "Other people," I whispered, barely able to believe I was even saying it. He nodded, his expression calm but serious, as if this idea had been brewing for a while. "I know it sounds strange, but it's not just about that. It's about us. I think it could bring something new to our relationship. I think we're missing something." I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. "Are we really missing something?" I asked, my voice cracking. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle. "Olivia, it's not about what's wrong. I just think there's something we haven't explored yet. Something that could bring us closer." I stared at him, feeling as though the ground was shifting beneath me. The man I had known for years, the one I had shared everything with, was now asking for something I hadn't even imagined. The confusion, the fear, the curiosity, they all collided within me, leaving me speechless. "We don't have to decide anything right now," he added quickly, sensing my hesitation. "I don't want to pressure you. Just think about it. We can talk more when you're ready." I pulled my hand away, the emptiness in the room more noticeable than ever. "And what if I'm not ready? If I can't?" My voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. He didn't respond immediately. His silence spoke volumes. I stood up, needing space, needing air. "I need to think," I muttered, walking away from the table and into the quiet of our living room. I realized then that this wasn't just about making a decision. It was about us, whether we could ever go back to what we once had. The decision came without warning, a quiet acceptance that settled over me, like the calm before the storm. Weeks passed, with tension building between us, neither of us daring to bring up the conversation again. But I could feel it, lingering between us, unspoken but always present. And then one night, in the soft light of our bedroom, he spoke again. "Let's take a trip," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Just you and me, away from everything. Away from all of this." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to resist, to stay in the safety of our routine. But something else, some quiet curiosity, nudged me forward. "Where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a house in the mountains. Quiet, secluded," he explained. "We can get away from everything and just talk. No pressure." Something about his tone felt rehearsed, like he had planned this all along. But I agreed, telling myself that this trip might give us the chance to reconnect and figure out where we stood before diving into something so uncertain. The drive seemed to stretch on forever, the winding roads unfurling ahead as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The silence between us felt thicker than usual, only broken by the hum of the car engine. I watched the trees blur by outside my window, lost in thought. What was I doing? Why had I agreed to this? Despite the swirling doubts, a nagging feeling I couldn't ignore told me I needed to understand. I needed to figure out why this was so important to him. When we finally arrived, the house looked exactly as he had described. Isolated, surrounded by towering trees, and with a view of distant mountains. It was peaceful, but there was something unsettling about it too. We were completely alone, miles from anyone else, just the two of us and the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. We settled in quickly, unpacking in near silence. I could sense his eyes on me as I moved around the cabin, but I deliberately avoided meeting his gaze. It wasn't until later that evening, with a glass of wine in front of each of us, that he finally spoke. "They'll be here tomorrow," he said, his voice low. I froze. "What? Who?" "The women," he answered, his tone cautious, as though he was testing the waters. "They'll be here in the afternoon." I set my glass down, the sound of it clinking against the table louder than it should have been. "You already invited them?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I thought it might be easier this way. Less time to overthink. No pressure, though. If you're not ready, we can send them away." My heart started racing as the reality of the situation hit me. I had thought this trip was about us, about figuring things out. But now everything was moving so quickly. They were already on their way. I stood up, needing space, needing air to clear my head. The cabin felt too small, suffocating. "I just need a minute," I muttered, stepping outside onto the porch. The cool mountain air hit me like a wave. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I could hear the faint rustling of the trees and the distant call of a bird. But my mind was too loud, too jumbled to focus on anything else. What was I doing here? Why had I let it get this far? Part of me wanted to turn around, march back inside, and tell him it was too much, that I couldn't do it. But another part of me, the part that had agreed to come in the first place, kept me standing there. As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until that moment. No matter how much I wanted to run, a small part of me was curious. Curious about what would happen if I stayed. Curious about how this might change things between us, for better or worse. I turned back toward the cabin, the soft glow of the light spilling out onto the porch, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would come, whether I was ready or not. The next day arrived too quickly. I woke with a knot in my stomach, unsure of what the day would bring. My husband was already up, moving around the kitchen as if it were any other morning, but it wasn't. Today felt different, and we both knew it. I sat quietly, sipping my coffee, trying to ignore the ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt as though I was waiting for something inevitable, something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. The air in the cabin felt thick with unspoken tension, and every movement seemed charged, as if we were both holding our breath, waiting for the moment to arrive. Around noon, I heard the soft rumble of a car approaching. My heart leapt into my throat. I put my cup down and glanced at my husband. He had stopped moving, his hand gripping the edge of the counter. He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared out the window, watching as the car pulled into the driveway. "They're here," he said quietly, almost to himself. I stood up slowly, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. I wasn't ready for this, but it was too late. The doorbell rang, an ordinary sound in any other situation, but in the charged silence of the cabin, it felt out of place. My husband moved to answer the door, and I followed, my heart hammering in my chest as he swung it open. There they were. The two women. They smiled warmly, stepping inside as if they were old friends. But I felt anything but comfortable. They were both effortlessly attractive, confident and at ease, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. I, on the other hand, felt like an outsider in my own skin. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, but the undercurrent of the situation was clear. We all knew why they were here, and no amount of small talk could hide it. I tried to act normal, to act like I wasn't completely overwhelmed, but my mind was racing. The wine helped dull the edge, but it didn't stop the questions buzzing in my head. How had we gotten here? Why was I letting this happen? At some point, the conversation shifted. The change was subtle, but I noticed it. One of the women, a tall brunette with dark eyes, leaned closer to my husband. Her laughter was soft and melodic as she placed her hand on his arm, the touch casual, almost too familiar. He looked at her, then at me, as if checking my reaction. I swallowed hard, unsure how to process it all. The other woman, a petite blonde, sat beside me. Her presence was warm but unobtrusive, though I could feel her eyes on me, studying me as if trying to figure out where I stood in all of this. Then, without warning, she leaned in closer. Her breath brushed against my cheek as she whispered, "You seem nervous. Is this too much?" I turned toward her, surprised by her directness. She wasn't prying, but there was a quiet understanding in her voice, a kind of reassurance I hadn't expected. For a moment, I felt an odd sense of calm before she moved even closer, her hand gently resting on mine. Then, in a gesture that felt almost natural, her lips brushed against mine. It wasn't forced. It wasn't something we had planned. Just happened. The kiss was light, quick, like a question lingering between us, unspoken. I pulled away, not because I rejected it, but because I couldn't quite grasp what had just occurred. My husband sat directly across from me, his eyes wide, frozen in place as he watched. His face was unreadable, caught between shock and something else. Something I didn't understand yet. But there was no turning back now. The moment had already passed, and we were in it. The shift in the room was tangible, a silent agreement passing between us all that we would continue. I glanced at the brunette, who had moved closer to my husband, her body almost leaning into his. Her gaze flicked to him, and I saw her tilt her head slightly, as if inviting him without words. He hesitated, meeting my eyes for just a second, but now there was no uncertainty there. Only a strange calmness that I couldn't place. And then it happened. They kissed. Slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not awkward. It was as if they had all the time in the world. I watched them, my mind spinning but strangely calm all the same. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. What I felt was more layered, more complex. A realization washed over me. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We had stepped into unknown territory, and there was no going back from here. I stood there, as though watching from outside my own body, as my life continued unfolding like a movie I wasn't part of. I wondered what would be left of us once it was over. The room felt smaller as the night went on, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The lightness of earlier had vanished, replaced with a heavy silence that made every small movement echo in the quiet. The women moved freely through the cabin, completely at ease, as if they belonged. But I felt like I was on the outside looking in, a spectator in my own life, as I watched something unfold that I couldn't control. I sat at the table, my hands still, my mind a chaotic mess. My husband and the brunette were now sitting on the couch, close, almost too close. Their shoulders brushed, and I could feel the weight of their proximity, the intimacy of it. The blonde, the one who had kissed me earlier, lingered nearby. Her eyes darted back and forth between me and the couple on the couch, trying to gauge my reaction. I could feel her attention on me, but I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't sure how I felt anymore. Every thought that crossed my mind felt jumbled, tangled in confusion, fear, and something darker I couldn't name. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it didn't bring me warmth. My skin felt cold, my chest tight as I wondered whether I was okay with what was happening. It wasn't just the kiss anymore. That was just the catalyst. Now I was staring at a version of my life I didn't recognize. My husband turned his head, his eyes meeting mine briefly. There was something in them. Uncertainty, anticipation. He was waiting for some kind of response, but I had nothing to offer. I was as lost as he was. I stood up abruptly, needing space, needing to breathe. "I'm going outside for a minute," I muttered, my voice barely cutting through the tension in the room. No one stopped me. The night air hit me hard, the chills sinking into my skin as I looked up at the scattered stars above. They felt so far away, like they were a world I could never reach. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold it together. The weight of the past few weeks pressed on me, suffocating me, making every breath feel like a struggle. I don't know how long I stayed out there, but eventually, I heard the creak of the door behind me. Without turning, I knew who it was. The blonde stepped up beside me, her footsteps light on the wooden porch. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice soft and understanding, like she could sense the storm inside me. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She didn't respond right away. She just stood beside me, letting the silence hang between us. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "You don't have to go through with this. You can stop it at any time." I swallowed, the words heavy in my chest. I don't know if stopping would make any difference anymore. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just stood there, waiting. There was no pressure, no hidden agenda. It was my choice and only mine to make. And as I stood there, staring into the dark, I realized that the moment for turning back had already passed. I stayed outside much longer than I meant to. The cold did nothing to calm the chaos inside me. My mind was racing, tangled in confusion and conflicting emotions. What had I allowed to happen? Could we ever go back to what we once had? Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. The warmth hit me immediately, but it didn't offer the comfort I had hoped for. The scene that greeted me felt even more surreal than before. My husband was on the couch with the brunette, sitting so close their bodies were almost pressed together. They both looked up as I walked in, their eyes trained on me, waiting for my next move. I walked over to the edge of the room, sitting as far away as I could. The blonde took a seat beside me, but she didn't speak. She just watched. It was clear she understood the weight of the moment, the unease hanging in the air. It stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until finally my husband spoke. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice careful. "We don't have to keep going if you're not ready." The way he said it, his eyes flicking to the brunette, made it clear that he wasn't asking for permission, but hoping for something else. I looked between them, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on me. I knew we were beyond the point of no return. This was no longer something we could sweep under the rug. The conversation we'd had weeks ago, the small hints, the escalating tension, all of it had led us here. How had things gotten so out of control so quickly? The brunette shifted, her body leaning in just slightly, her hand resting gently on his arm. It seemed so small, so simple, but it struck me like a blow to the chest. I couldn't sit there and watch any longer. It felt as though I was being pushed out of my own life, a helpless observer as everything I thought I understood slipped away. I didn't think, just stood up, the weight of everything pressing heavily in my stomach. My voice was shaky, but I somehow managed to force out, "I can't do this." I thought I could, but I can't. The words rushed out before I could stop them, and once they were spoken, they lingered in the air, irreversible. My husband's face changed. A flicker of disappointment crossed his features. He opened his mouth, probably to say something, but I couldn't bear to hear it. I was done. Done trying to talk myself into this, done pretending I was okay. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice a little stronger this time. I could feel the tears fighting to surface, but I held them back, refusing to let them fall. I couldn't stay. Not like this. The blonde stood up too, stepping toward me. "You don't have to go," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Take a moment, breathe. You can come back when you're ready." But I wasn't ready. And I wasn't sure I ever would be. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I can't." I turned toward the door, each step feeling like it took me further from something I couldn't reach anymore. My hand gripped the handle, but before I opened it, I heard my husband's voice from behind me. It was soft, almost pleading. "Olivia, please don't go like this. We can figure this out." His words felt hollow, like they came from someone I no longer recognized. I paused for a moment, my hand still on the door. Part of me wanted to turn around to look at him and see the man I had once known. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I opened the door and stepped into the cold night, the chill biting into my skin. It was a reminder that I was still here, still real. I walked away from the cabin, from everything I had once known, feeling a strange mix of relief and loss. The drive home was suffocating in its silence. The weight of everything that had happened pressed so heavily on my chest that it was hard to breathe. The cabin, the women, the kiss. It all felt like a surreal dream I couldn't wake up from. But the pit in my stomach reminded me that it was all real. And now, as I pulled up to our house, I wasn't sure what to do next. I parked the car and stared at the front door, feeling like a stranger. It looked so ordinary, but stepping inside felt impossible. The place I had once called home now felt foreign, like I didn't belong there anymore. The silence of the night pressed against the windows as I sat there, frozen in the car, unsure of what came next. When I finally opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the house surrounded me, but it did nothing to ease the unease that had settled deep in my bones. I wandered through the rooms, each space a reminder of the life we had built, a life that now seemed to be unraveling. I checked my phone. Several messages from him, each one more urgent than the last. I knew he'd be home soon and we'd have to talk. But what was there to say? How do you fix something that's already so broken? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, ready to reply, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me wanted to pretend none of this had happened, to rewind to a simpler time. But that part of me was fading, drowned out by the harsh realization that things had changed beyond repair. Just then, I heard the rumble of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart sank, the reality of everything crashing down on me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. When the door opened, his footsteps were slow, hesitant. He walked into the room and our eyes met. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there waiting for me to speak, to make the first move. The silence between us felt unbearable, filled with all the words we were too afraid to say. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "Olivia, we can't leave things like this." I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but they got stuck in my throat. "I don't know how we're supposed to fix this," I replied, my voice shaky. His eyes softened, and for a moment I thought he might say something reassuring, something that would make it all better. But then he said something I didn't expect. "Maybe we can't." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. I felt my heart tighten, 1,000 questions flooding my mind. What did he mean? Was this the end? But before I could ask, he turned and walked toward the bedroom. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving me alone at the table, staring into the empty space where he had just stood. And just like that, the uncertainty I'd been avoiding consumed me.